1988. Janitor's locked drawer exposed a priest's secret and a girl who disappeared. They always said the church had no secrets, that its walls only echoed the words of God and the soft hush of prayer. But that was never true. Some churches don't echo, they absorb. They take in what no one dares say aloud: the silent glances, the half-written complaints, the stories buried deeper than the stained glass light could ever reach. Some truths don't disappear. They wait. In dust, in metal, in drawers nobody's opened since the spring of 1988. I didn't come back to this town to dig anything up. Not memories, not pain, and definitely not my grandfather's ghost. I came back because I had nowhere else to go. It was early fall when I returned to St. Bartholomew's. The leaves hadn't yet changed, but the air had that dry bite of a season preparing to turn. Work out west had dried up. Construction contracts canceled. My savings had thinned like the paint on a chapel ceiling. A friend on the town council, someone who still remembered my last name, called and said the church needed help. Just refurbishing the back halls, he told me. Old paneling, floorboards, nothing complicated. He didn't mention the office or the drawer. The church looked smaller than I remembered. Isn't that always the way? When I was a boy, the sanctuary seemed endless, a canyon of hymnals and holy echoes. But now it looked tired, not broken, but sagging a little, like it had inhaled decades of secrets and never remembered to exhale. The maintenance office was in the back, behind the old boiler room, a place my grandfather, Joseph Langston, had called his evening chapel. He spent more hours in there than anyone ever noticed, and when he died, they sealed it off. Not officially, but in that slow, passive way people forget places on purpose. The window was stuck open a half inch, the carpet still damp with oil and mildew. No one had vacuumed, no one had bothered. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before walking in. The air hit me like a memory, sharp, metallic, and lonely. The desk was still there, shoved against the far wall like it had always been. I knew that desk. I had sat beside it once, watching him sketch out heater diagrams on scrap envelopes, teaching me how to calculate water pressure and voltage with the patience of a man who knew his worth came not from titles, but from how well he could keep things warm in winter. That's when I noticed it. The drawer. I don't know what drew my eye. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the brass handle, catching just enough light to feel intentional. Maybe it was that quiet pull in the gut, the kind you only get when you're standing close to something that matters, even if you don't know why. I knelt down and pulled. It didn't move. Locked. The desk was otherwise bare. No padlocks, no security. Just one drawer, jammed shut and sealed by decades of disinterest. I tugged harder. Nothing. I even tried rocking the desk a little, thinking maybe it was warped from water damage. But no, the drawer wasn't stuck. It was secured. I stood up and took a step back. My breath had shortened without me noticing. Not from the effort, but from something else. That feeling again. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. Or maybe like I was the only one meant to be. Later that afternoon, I asked around. Pete, an old maintenance guy who still worked part-time and remembered my grandfather, shrugged when I brought it up. That drawer, he said, chewing on a toothpick, been shut since the 80s. Nobody's ever touched it. Probably empty. I wanted to believe that. I really did. Because something about the way Pete dismissed it, like it was harmless, like it didn't matter, only made it feel heavier. The church had no secrets, they said. But I remembered my grandfather's face at dinner tables, his eyes distant sometimes, especially in that last year. I remembered the way he used to sit a little longer at night, alone, after everyone else had gone to bed. I remembered a quiet conversation I once overheard. Him and my mother, voices low, something about a girl, something about doing the right thing even if no one else will. I was too young then to understand what that meant. But now, standing in his old office, staring at a drawer that refused to budge, I began to wonder if something had stayed locked, not because it was meant to be hidden forever, but because it was waiting for someone who still carried his name. And for the first time since I returned, I realized I hadn't just come back to fix the floors. I'd come back to open something. I returned to the church 3 days later, not with prayers, not with faith, but with a lockpick kit. It wasn't the kind you see in movies, no high-tech gadgets or spy gear, just a small leather pouch with a few slender picks and tension wrenches I'd learned to use years ago while working construction, back when old storage sheds with jammed locks were more common than permits. I didn't bring it because I expected to find something explosive. I brought it because I couldn't stop thinking about that drawer. It followed me home, into my sleep, into my dreams. Even as I ate cereal in the quiet of my apartment, I felt it breathing behind me. The drawer wasn't just locked, it was calling. The church was empty that morning, the kind of quiet that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Light filtered through the stained glass, throwing fragments of color across the dusty floor, like confetti at a funeral. My footsteps echoed differently in the back corridor, less like sound and more like memory stirring. The door to the maintenance room creaked as I opened it. The air smelled the same: oil, mildew, time. My grandfather's desk sat exactly as I'd left it, brass handle glinting in the slant of morning sun. I sat on the floor, took a breath, slipped the pick into the keyway. Click, tension, ease. Click again. It took nearly 20 minutes, long enough for me to doubt everything, long enough for my hands to sweat, then dry again. And then, with one final shift, the lock gave a subtle sigh, as if the drawer had waited just long enough to be sure I'd earned it. It opened with a slow groan. Inside, everything was painfully neat. A folded towel, a flashlight, long dead, its metal casing scratched and cold, a sealed manila envelope, and a small bundle of Polaroids wrapped in a rubber band, edges worn soft from age. My fingers hovered over the envelope first. On the flap, in faded blue ink, "If you find this, forgive me." No name, no address, just that. I peeled it open with trembling hands. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowed, folded twice, and written in a slow, deliberate script I hadn't seen since I was 12. I recognized it instantly. My grandfather's handwriting, the loops of his lowercase g's, the way he dotted his I's with downward flicks. I hadn't realized how deeply his penmanship was carved into my memory until that moment. How seeing it again felt like hearing his voice in my chest. The date, At the top, April 3rd, 1988. Then the first line. If you're reading this, it means no one ever listened. Not then. Maybe now. I'm sorry, but I have to write it all somewhere. I read slowly, carefully. The letter told the story of a girl. 17, quiet, volunteering in the youth ministry. She'd come to him late one evening, crying in the west hallway near the boiler room. Said something terrible had happened. Said she'd been hurt, not by a stranger, by someone she trusted. A man in a collar. Father Ellis. I froze. That name, it wasn't just familiar. It was part of the fabric of my childhood. He was the man who baptized me, who led my mother's wedding service, who delivered the eulogy at my grandfather's funeral. He was revered, admired, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones at potlucks and funerals. And now, here he was, at the center of something unspeakable. My grandfather had written, I reported it. I gave the file to Ellis himself, and another copy to the diocese. They told me it would be handled, that it would be taken care of internally. But nothing happened. The girl was gone the next day. Transferred, they said. I can't sleep. I see her face. I see the fear. And I know if I stay quiet, I'm as guilty as they are. The paper trembled in my grip. But not from age. From me. My hands were shaking. I set the letter down and opened the bundle of Polaroids. 4 photographs. The first, a dimly lit hallway, empty. The youth wing, judging by the green carpet and paneled walls. The second, a teenage girl sitting on the chapel steps, head down, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The third, a man turning sharply toward the camera, mouth slightly open, as if he'd just noticed the photographer. The fourth, blurred. Motion. Maybe struggle. I turned the second photo over. There, in faint ink, Jody March. I whispered the name aloud. It felt like saying something sacred or forbidden. Beneath the Polaroids was a carbon copy of a typed complaint. Church letterhead, dated April 2nd, 1988. At the bottom, filed by Joseph Langston. A large red stamp over it. Received. He had done it. He'd tried. He'd spoken up. He died 3 days later. They said it was heart failure. No autopsy. No second opinions. Just quiet nods and sad casseroles. But now, I felt something else beating behind my ribs. A rhythm I hadn't felt since I was a child. The heartbeat of suspicion. The drum of truth. I didn't sleep that night. I scanned everything. The letter, the photos, the complaint. Made digital backups. Stored them in multiple folders with encrypted names. Labeled each one like evidence. Because that's what they were. Evidence. Not just of a crime, but of a cover-up. In the quiet of 3 a.m., I stared out my apartment window, watching the wind play with the shadows outside the gate of the old parsonage across the street. Every rustle felt loaded. Every creak of floorboard a whisper. Not of ghosts, but of voices long silenced. Jody March. She was out there somewhere. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she disappeared like so many others. Folded into silence. Swept under pews and behind stained glass where sunlight doesn't ask questions. But I wasn't going to let this stay buried. I opened a blank folder on my desktop. Langston Archive. I started building a timeline. April 1st. Jody attends retreat. April sent. Incident. Complaint filed. April 3rd. Letter written. April 4th. Joseph Langston dies. 4 days. 4 pages of history the church never meant to have anyone read. As I stared at the screen, one thought wouldn't leave me. Someone new. Someone besides Ellis. Because churches don't run in isolation. Someone handled the mail. Someone received the complaint. Someone stamped it, no further action. That someone, whoever they were, had chosen silence. And if I had the letter, the Polaroids, the stamped complaint, then I wasn't holding forgotten scraps. I was holding a detonator. The only question was, who else knew it existed? And would they let me walk back into that church again? It was just a name, written in faint blue pen on the back of a Polaroid. But it changed everything. Jody March. The way my grandfather wrote it, careful, upright strokes, as if etching the truth into something fragile, made me feel like he had wanted someone to find it, to remember her, to speak her name again. But when I typed it into every search bar I could think of, the results came back as if she had never existed. No yearbook photos, no marriage license, no obituary, no missing persons report, no church bulletins, nothing. Like a shadow that never made contact with the ground. I didn't panic. Not yet. I knew from the beginning that this wasn't going to be easy. If the system had worked to erase her, then it had done its job well. But the drawer had been locked, the photos had been saved, and her name, faint as it was, had survived 3.5 decades. I started small. Local records, microfiche scans from the town library, retreat logs, youth ministry binders from 1988, the dusty kind stored in moldy boxes below the old chapel. The basement archive was a mess, pages stuck together. Mice had chewed through half the cardboard, but I remembered what my grandfather once told me, one night, as we fixed a radiator together in our old garage. Truth doesn't hide where it's pretty. It hides where no one bothers to look. So I looked. Hours passed. I combed through choir rosters, donation slips, camp registrations. And just as my patience began to crumble under the weight of a dozen yellowing envelopes, I found it. A binder labeled Youth Ministry Retreats, 1988. Inside, the pages had that slight musty warp from age, but most of the text was still legible. Sign-in sheets, transportation forms, emergency contact lists. On page 3, there it was. March, Jody, age 17, cabin 4B, no listed guardian, no emergency contact. Instead, sponsored by parish fund. Sponsored. That word clung to me, because it meant she didn't have anyone. No parent checking her in, no number to call, just a church signing on her behalf. A girl alone in the care of men who claimed divine authority. I flipped to the back of the binder. Counselor notes. Most were mundane. Great energy from Group 2 this year. Cabin 1 had a prank war. All in good fun. And then, scrawled in blocky, uneven handwriting, J. March requested to leave early, escorted off-site by Father E. No date, no follow-up, no witness signature. My stomach tightened. I'd volunteered for retreats myself as a teen. We had protocols, check-in, check-out, paperwork for every move, especially when minors were involved. You didn't just let a 17-year-old girl disappear into the back seat of a priest's car without a written record, without another adult present, without questions, unless you wanted it that way. I photographed every page with my phone, hands shaking slightly. These weren't just church records. They were fault lines beneath something far older and far more dangerous than I had realized. I needed someone who remembered, someone who had been there. And there was one name that hadn't left my mind since the drawer opened. Elaine Kerrigan. She had been the church secretary for almost 30 years. Retired now. Lived 2 blocks behind the bakery in a small blue cottage with overgrown lilacs and a rusted mailbox. She opened the door before I even knocked. "You look just like your grandfather," she said softly, not with surprise, but with the kind of resignation that comes when a truth has waited too long. I nodded. I found the file. She didn't ask which one. She simply stepped back and let me in. Her sunroom smelled of lavender and old paper, the kind of warmth that felt stitched together by decades of filing cabinets and Sunday morning bulletins. I laid the Polaroids and copied pages of the retreat binder on her table, watching her expression shift as she scanned each piece. Her hand hovered over the photo of Jody, fingers trembling slightly. "He told me," she whispered, "Joe, about the girl. He came to me after she cried in the hallway, said she looked like someone drowning without water, said he couldn't sleep." I leaned in. "Did you tell him to report it?" "I told him not to report it to Ellis," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "I told him to go to the police, but Joe, he was a man of structure, chain of command. He thought the church deserved the chance to do the right thing. And when they didn't," her eyes darkened, "he mailed a second copy to the diocese. I saw him drop it into the mailbox across from the church the same afternoon he gave the first one to Ellis. The next morning, he didn't come to work. They said heart failure. But Joe didn't have heart problems. His blood pressure was perfect. He walked every evening, ate oatmeal and kale every morning. They didn't kill him, no, but they killed something in him the night before. That's what broke him." Silence fell, the kind that felt not empty, but reverent. I wanted to ask more, wanted to demand why she never spoke up, why she let my mother bury her father under the weight of unanswered questions. But she answered before I could speak. "I was scared," she said, her voice cracking. "I convinced him to follow the process. When the process failed, I felt like I had sent him to his death. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't feel something, but because too much was rising too fast." She reached out and placed a hand over mine. Thin, warm, worn from time, but firm. "But you," she said, looking me dead in the eye, "you found more than he ever could. You've pulled light into a place that's been rotting in shadow for decades. Don't let it die again." I swallowed hard. "I won't." I meant it. That night, back at my apartment, I opened a new folder on my desktop. Langston Archive, active. I scanned every page, every note, every scribble in my grandfather's hand. I cataloged the retreat documents, tagged the names, highlighted the chain of events. I started a timeline on the wall. Pins, string, photos, like something out of a detective's dream. April 1st, retreat begins. April 2nd, assault reported April 3rd. Letter written. April 4th, Joe Langston dies. It was too clean, too precise. like the whole thing had been choreographed. And then, in the upper corner of the complaint copy, a detail I hadn't noticed before. A faint red stamp, nearly erased by time. I enhanced it digitally, increased contrast, zoomed. There it was, reviewed. No further action. GE initials. Not Ellis. Someone higher, someone watching, a gatekeeper. I stared at those letters as if they were fingerprints left in blood. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about one priest. It was about a system. He stared at the initials for a long time. GE. They lingered in the bottom right corner of the scanned complaint, like a red seal of finality. Reviewed. No further action. As if a single stroke of bureaucratic ink had the power to erase what had happened in that hallway. As if the truth could be reduced to an administrative shrug. But GE wasn't just a stamp. Marcus was sure of it now. It was a signature, not of a priest, but of someone higher. Someone who didn't wear robes, but moved the people who did, like chess pieces. He started digging. Old diocesan newsletters, board announcements, church directories scanned from fax paper and archived in corners of the internet most people never thought to look. He knew the name before he saw it. Something in his chest had already put the pieces together. George Ellsworth, the diocesan administrator in 1988. Not clergy, not ordained, but a man whose name appeared in every financial committee note, every staff transition, every complaint log, always in the margins, never in the pulpit. His mother had mentioned him once when Marcus was younger. He never blinked, she said, eyes like ice, like he was always keeping count of something invisible. It fit. Ellsworth had overseen internal reviews, managed incoming complaints, liaised with the Archbishop's office. He was the firewall, the man who decided what made it to daylight and what stayed buried in the cellar of silence. Marcus found an address in a Christmas card directory from the 1990s, handwritten, neatly updated with a new zip code. Ellsworth was now retired, living 2 counties over, in a gated community designed for clergy and diocesan staff. He didn't call. He drove. The neighborhood felt plastic. Lawns too trimmed, driveways spotless, rows of beige homes with flower beds engineered for symmetry. Marcus parked half a block away and walked, the envelope in his pocket heavier than he expected. He didn't plan what he would say. There was no script for this. Only heat in his chest and a dull pressure behind his eyes that had built since the moment that drawer opened. When he knocked, the door cracked open just a sliver. "Yes?" a man's voice said, cautious and low. "Mr. Ellsworth?" Marcus asked. There was a pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Marcus Langston, Joseph Langston's grandson." The pause became a silence. Then the door opened wider. Ellsworth hadn't aged softly. His white hair was combed to precision, but the lines on his face looked carved. His posture was rigid, military almost. He didn't offer a handshake. "I know who your grandfather was," he said flatly. "What do you want?" "I want the truth," Marcus said. Another pause. Then, with visible reluctance, Ellsworth stepped back. 5 minutes. Marcus followed him into a room that smelled of furniture polish and something antiseptic. The walls were lined with framed certificates and fading photos of banquets and fundraisers. The house looked like it had been arranged not for living, but for display. I found his complaint, Marcus said, standing. The one he filed in April of 1988. With your stamp on it. Ellsworth gave a slight nod. I assumed someone would eventually dig it up. You read it. You saw the photos, the letter, and you stamped it. No further action. Ellsworth didn't flinch. Do you know how many reports came across my desk that year? How many people expected us to unravel the entire church over a handful of accusations? Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. That wasn't a handful. That was a girl, 17, hurt and ignored. Ellsworth's jaw tightened. She was a foster child. No family, no legal advocate, no follow-up. That makes it easier, doesn't it? Marcus snapped. No one to ask questions. No one to fight back. The older man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't deny it. We triaged, he said. We assessed institutional risk. We were under pressure. Lawsuits, media, lawsuits again. We did what the church demanded. And what about Ellis? What about him? He assaulted a girl. And you knew. Ellsworth stared at him. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, resentment. Your grandfather pushed, harder than most. And when the machine didn't move, he blamed himself. That's not on me. You think that makes you clean? Marcus's voice broke slightly. He died 3 days later. Ellsworth didn't respond. He walked down a hallway and returned with a folder. Tossed it onto the coffee table. Here, he said. Everything. His complaint, my notes, the original. I kept it. Not out of guilt. I don't believe in emotional bookkeeping. I kept it because I knew someone like you would show up eventually. Marcus stared at the folder, then at him. You've had this for 35 years. Ellsworth didn't answer. He opened the front door. The conversation was over. Marcus left without another word. He sat in his car and opened the folder. Everything was there. The same letter, same photos. But something else. A group picture from the retreat. Dozens of teens and staff lined up in front of a weathered church sign. In the second row, Jody March stood stiffly, her hands folded in front of her, face unreadable. Behind her stood Ellis. His hand rested on her shoulder. His mouth smiled, but his eyes were locked on something just out of frame. Marcus's breath caught. He knew then that this wasn't just a case of failure. This was engineered, quietly, methodically. Ellsworth hadn't acted alone. There were more. Layers of silence built not by mistake, but by design. When he returned home, he digitized the entire file, saving everything in encrypted backups, labeled and stored. He wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. He was building a case. But documents weren't enough. He needed voices. He needed someone else who had been there. Someone who could fill in what even his grandfather hadn't known. He called Kerrigan again. There was a youth coordinator, she said slowly. Young, just out of college. Marianne something. Sweet girl. Only worked a year. It took hours. Phone calls, archive searches, dead ends. Then finally, a profile. Marianne Gates, now retired. Former trauma counselor for survivors of institutional abuse. Living in Oregon. Marcus sat with the screen glowing in front of him. The coincidence was too sharp, too pointed. He picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on her last known professional registry. The line clicked. Hello? A calm voice answered. "Ms. Gates?" Marcus said. "My name is Marcus Langston. I think you were at a retreat in 1988, St. Bartholomew's." Silence. Then, finally, quietly, "I knew this day would come." The voice on the other end of the line didn't tremble. It didn't rush or hesitate or try to avoid the moment. Instead, it spoke like someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation in silence for over 3 decades. "I knew this day would come." Marcus sat with the phone pressed to his ear, heart thudding quietly in his chest. "I found the complaint," he said. "The photos, my grandfather's letter." He could hear her breath, steady, deliberate. Then, "If you're serious about the truth, come in person." That was all. She gave him the address. A small town tucked between the Oregon coast and the forested ridgelines, a place where people went to disappear, not to be found. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Something in her voice told him she had been waiting not for a reporter, or a bishop, or even the police, but for someone like him. Someone who carried both memory and blood. He drove 10 hours through winding mountain roads, his grandfather's envelope, and Ellis's retreat photo, riding beside him in the passenger seat like witnesses. When he arrived, the wind smelled of pine and salt. Her house sat on a quiet ridge above the tree line, weather-beaten but sturdy. The kind of home where truth could finally land without being blown away. Marianne Gates opened the door without a smile. She was in her early 60s now. Her gray hair tied back in a thick braid, face lined with years not just of aging, but of weight carried alone. She didn't offer small talk, didn't ask what he wanted. She simply looked at him, then nodded toward the living room. There were 2 cups of tea already set on the table. "You came all this way," she said, "for a girl everyone forgot." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't forget, and neither did he." He placed the photo of Jody March on the table. Marianne's fingers hovered over it. Then she picked it up, gently, like handling something that might bruise if touched too hard. "She was too still," she whispered. "Even on the first day. 17. But she moved like someone who'd learned how to disappear without ever leaving." Marcus waited. "I remember the way she asked to sleep by the emergency exit," Marianne said. "She told me she had nightmares about locked rooms and whispered voices. I thought maybe it was just the stress of camp. But every time Father Ellis entered the room, she shrank. She never spoke to him, never met his eyes." She looked up, her eyes wet but unflinching. "I didn't see it then. Not clearly, but I should have." "Do you remember the last day?" Marcus asked. She nodded. "She missed breakfast. I asked around, and one of the junior counselors said Ellis had taken her for a walk, said she'd asked to leave early, but no one saw her go. No one saw her come back. By dinner, she was gone." She walked down a hallway and returned with a folder, worn, soft with age. Inside was a retreat roster, annotated counselor logs, and one single page labeled "Sensitive, Internal Use Only." She handed it to Marcus. He read it slowly. Subject: J. March. Exhibits signs of spiritual distress. Requested early dismissal. Escorted from site by Reverend E. There was no date, no secondary signature, just a flat, clinical sentence in the middle of a sheet meant to log something holy. "That was a lie," Marianne said quietly. "She never asked to leave." No one saw her pack. No one saw her board a car. Ella said she needed solitude, that she was overwhelmed and in need of spiritual realignment. And then she vanished. Marcus looked at her, his voice low. "Did you tell anyone?" "I filed this report," she said, tapping the paper, "but Ellis intercepted it. I later learned it never left the retreat office. A week later, I was reassigned, out of state, told it was a promotion. But I knew better." She reached into the folder again, pulling out a second page, a letter she had typed but never mailed. It began with one sentence. "I am writing not as a counselor, but as a witness afraid of her own silence." Marcus read it twice. "I couldn't send it," she said, "because I thought I was alone, because I thought silence was safety, because the institution knows how to shame those who whisper too loud." He placed the letter down carefully. "You're not alone now." She nodded. "You said your grandfather tried?" she asked. "He reported it to Ellis directly, and to the diocese. Then, 3 days later, he died." Marianne didn't speak for a long time. Then softly, "They didn't kill him, but they killed something inside him, and it takes a rare kind of man to carry that weight in silence." Marcus nodded. He knew. They sat in silence for a while. The tea had gone cold, but neither moved to replace it. Truth didn't require warmth, only courage. Then Marianne said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "I used to think churches were built to keep the world out," she said, "but maybe they were built to keep the truth in." The sentence hit like scripture. When Marcus returned to town 2 days later, he didn't go home. He drove straight to the church. The sun was beginning to set, casting gold through the stained glass windows. The hallways were empty, still, as if they, too, were holding their breath. Father Adams, the current pastor, had given him the key to the archive room a week earlier, after Marcus asked for permission to review old maintenance logs. He hadn't mentioned why. Now he used that key to unlock the filing cabinet labeled 1988. He flipped slowly. Marriage licenses, volunteer forms, staff tax records. Then, Langston Joseph, complaint, filed, stamped, unread. He pulled the file and opened it on the nearby table. Inside, the original complaint letter, the photos, the signature, but one more thing, a second stamp, almost invisible from age. Reviewed, closed, no further action. And in the bottom margin, handwritten in red pen, destroy after review, G.E. Marcus stared at the words until they blurred, but his grandfather hadn't destroyed it. He had made a copy, kept it, preserved it in a drawer locked tighter than silence. And now, so had Marcus. He scanned every page again, uploaded everything to the Langston archive, created a backup, then another, cloud folders, USBs, offline duplicates. There would be no more lost paperwork, no more shadows. He left the church long after dusk, his fingers still tingling from the page edges. He didn't feel peace, not yet, but he felt something close. That night, he received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a photograph. Faded. Black and white. A young janitor, Joseph Langston, standing beside a priest outside the old church doors, both smiling. On the back, written in pen, "Some things are worth cleaning more than once." There was no signature, but Marcus didn't need one. It had been 6 months since the article went live. 6 months since the Langston file hit the front page of the Sunday edition, above the fold. printed in black ink bold enough to shake a sanctuary. 6 months since the world learned that a quiet janitor had tried to stop a predator and had been buried with the truth. The backlash came fast. Church officials denied knowledge. Parish boards released vague statements about historical discrepancies. Anonymous letters arrived in Marcus's mailbox, some accusing, some apologizing, most unsigned. But louder than the pushback were the voices that had waited years, decades, to speak. Former youth volunteers, counselors, secretaries. A retired priest from Ohio wrote, "I saw what Ellis did. I was too much of a coward to speak. I've lived with that shame for 34 years. Your grandfather did what I couldn't." Survivors began sending scanned pages, old letters, canceled checks, journals, bulletin clippings. The Langston archive grew from a folder on Marcus's hard drive to a public digital ledger, encrypted and triple-backed, where the erased could finally leave their mark. People wrote from across the country. One woman in Pennsylvania sent a photocopy of a complaint she had filed in 1989, stamped, redacted, dismissed. Another, in Michigan, mailed a handwritten note that said simply, "I was 12. He was my confessor. I never said his name out loud until I read your story. Now I can't stop. Ellis, Ellis, Ellis. He was not a man of God. He was a man of habit and cover." But the most unexpected letter came from someone Marcus had once thought might never resurface. Jody March. It began with one line. I wondered if anyone would ever ask. She was older now, living quietly in Northern Oregon under a different name. She had changed addresses, changed jobs, changed almost everything except the part of her that never stopped remembering. She called Marcus the day the story broke nationally. Her voice was calm, wiser, but not broken. "I remember your grandfather," she said. "He found me behind the chapel steps. I was shaking. I couldn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just said, 'You're not invisible.' It was the first time in years I felt seen." Marcus couldn't speak for a moment. Then, quietly, he filed a complaint. He tried. "I know," she said, "and I never got to thank him." She gave her full permission for her name and story to be included in future reports. "Just tell it right," she said. The diocese, under mounting pressure, reopened the investigation. Father Ellis's name was removed from the youth wing of the church. His portrait, which once hung outside the community room, was quietly taken down one morning. No press release, no apology. But someone noticed. A local artist who had grown up in the church offered to create something new. A bronze plaque, simple, clean, permanent. One evening, the congregation gathered, not for a sermon, not for hymns, just to remember. The plaque was unveiled outside the boiler room hallway, the one where Joseph Langston spent most of his working life. It read, "In memory of Joseph Langston, custodian, witness, keeper of light. He saw what others looked away from, and he stayed." There was no applause, just breath. Deep, collective breath. The kind that comes when something sacred is finally spoken out loud. Marcus stayed after everyone left. He ran his fingers across the edge of the plaque. It was cold to the touch, but solid. For the first time, his grandfather's name wasn't a footnote. It was carved where people could see it. Ask about it. Remember it. That night, he returned home to find an envelope waiting for him. Again, no return address. Inside was a journal entry, worn, photocopied. The handwriting was unmistakably female and shaky. The date at the top, April 3rd, 1988. He saw me, didn't ask questions, didn't explain my fear away, just said, "You're not crazy, and you're not alone." I've carried that line for 35 years. I wrote this because I didn't think I'd ever tell anyone else. But now I want someone to know that even if the system forgot me, he didn't. Signed, Jody M. Marcus placed the page inside a clear, archival sleeve and added it to the Langston archive, not as evidence, as testimony. A week later, Jody came to town. They met by the river behind the church, the same place where the youth group once held baptisms, the same water that had held ceremony and sorrow, sometimes on the same day. She looked different than the girl in the Polaroid. Her hair was short now, silver strands at the temples, but her eyes, clear, resilient, were the same. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't," Marcus replied. She looked out across the water for a long time. "I wanted to see where it ended, or maybe where it started." They sat on a worn bench, weathered from decades of wind and silence. Marcus handed her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it. It was his grandfather's key ring. The old brass keys clinked together softly in her hand. She didn't cry. She just nodded. "That sound," she said, "used to tell me I had 10 seconds to breathe before someone walked past. He always gave me time." Then she reached into her coat and handed him something another envelope. Inside, a copy of a second journal entry, dated April 2nd, the day before the complaint was filed. I told him what happened. I thought he would tell me I was mistaken, or worse, that it was my fault. But instead, he handed me a cup of tea and said, "We fix things here. That's our job. Not to look away, but to stay until it's clean." Jody looked at Marcus. "It's not just his story anymore," she said. "It's mine too." And then she stood. "Whatever you build next, don't let them write us out again." "I won't," he said, and he meant it. The Langston Ledger now receives hundreds of submissions a month. Some are full stories. Some are fragments, initials, memories, torn pages mailed from post offices across the country. But each one adds to the weight of truth. Because justice, real justice, isn't always about courtrooms and headlines. Sometimes it's about a drawer finally opened, a name finally spoken, a girl finally remembered, and a man, long dismissed as just the janitor, finally seen as what he was: a witness, a keeper of light, and the reason others now believe they, too, can speak. Marcus still walks past that boiler room sometimes. The plaque catches the light just right in the evening sun. Sometimes he stands there, just listening. And on rare nights, when the wind is quiet and the church is still, he swears he can hear it, that gentle jingle of brass keys. Not loud, not mournful, just a sound that says, it's safe to keep going.